Europe is leading the world in transitioning its major cities to be cycle first. Amsterdam, Paris, Copenhagen in particular have pioneered the implementation of low-risk cycling infrastructure, and the public adoption has exceeded expectations. Asia and Oceania are well behind, further compounding the challenge of achieving net zero by 2050. While lessons can be learned from the Northern Hemisphere, it's not quite as straightforward as resetting planning policy to embrace cycle first. Professor Matthew Burke joins us now. Matthew is the Deputy Director of Griffith University's Cities Research Institute. Professor, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. Now, in recent years, there's been a significant investment in dedicated cycleways and bike paths. But you believe, and in fact, you've been public about this, in saying that that's just not enough.
It's the rate at which we're developing that's not enough. You know, I'm quoted as saying this a number of times now that, you know, I don't have children, but if I had a child in the next couple of years, it would only be my grandchildren who might, near the middle age of their life, actually see a low-risk quality cycling network in Australia at the rate we're developing it. So we're not able to transition or make the kind of contribution to net zero that we hope cycling could make by the year 2050. And it's not just cycling now, it's also all those micro-electric modes, the light electric scooters, the e-bikes and the other modes of transportation that have made, you know, this kind of shared path travel available to a much wider segment of the community than ever before.
Now, Matt, you're doing a lot of work on this at the moment in different spaces. At the moment, you're working on 3 projects with regards to cycling right now. Your first one is planning contentious cycling infrastructure in existing neighbourhoods. Tell us a little bit about this and how that's going.
Yeah, so we're working with the Brisbane City Council, and we're looking at how they plan their bikeways, and we've been following the officers as they've gone and done community consultation and other things. We're just trying to learn how better to do that kind of consultation. And I think we've got some problems with how we do transport planning in Australian cities, not just here in New Zealand, much of the world actually. So, for instance, my street out the very front here was resealed for the first time in decades just recently, and they cut up all the bitumen, relaid it, and they relaid the street exactly like it was laid down in the 1970s. And the way the street is designed is really not good for pedestrians. It's not really good for anyone but motorists who would like to drive fast through this neighbourhood. And no one came to this community and said, how could we do 3 things to do this better? What little things could we do when we reseal and relay this street that would really make it better for you as a community? And there are some really simple things here that would have made it much better for walking and cycling. And the other problem there, of course, is speed limits, but we might get to that a bit later in this discussion. But because 50k per hour streets on a tiny little street like this in suburbia is really quite inappropriate.
Well, let's touch on speed limits. While we're talking about it, what should speed limits be? You know, I suppose within communities like the ones that you've just been describing. Where I live locally, I also have 50 as the speed limit at my streets around my house.
Most of us live on a 50k per hour street. Most of us live deep in suburbia or in the grid of an inner suburb on a street that really doesn't warrant lots of traffic, doesn't have a lot of traffic. And that percentage of streets, probably 80% of urban streets in Australia, should really be at 30k per hour. And it's not just me saying that, it's now the Europeans, the British, the Americans, Washington, DC, all their little local streets are now down at 20 miles per hour, 30k per hour. And they're now introducing safety zones at schools that are even lower than that. We still think we're giving safety to school kids at 40k per hour. And that's, it's just not truthful. And it's really not what we should be doing.
One of your other research projects that you're working on at the moment is one that I find particularly interesting, and that's the use of e-scooters and the e-bike, the sharing systems, the public sharing systems that are out there. What are you finding? Because you're doing some research on both the impacts but also the benefits of these kind of systems.
Yeah, so we've done a series of studies here on these new public e-scooter systems, and probably the one that got the most attention was the first to ever look at the tourism impacts of these new devices. And we wanted to know where visitors were going with the scooters. And in particular, we wanted to know whether scootering seemed to affect their spending habits. And we had a couple of key findings. First of all, it wasn't just young men on scooters. There were lots of women, and there were boomers on scooters. So this was, the myth is it's all younger people going crazy, having fun. Here we had older generations, Gen Xers and boomers, using them in large numbers to do purposeful travel for tourism. The other key finding was the people, they'd all paid the same amount for a weekend pass for their scooter travel, but those who used the scooters more spent the most, and spent the most also, it looked like, from their destinations in what we would call mum and dad businesses, local cafes, local restaurants, local retailers.
Just before we go, Matt, I wanted to touch on this last area, this third area of research rather that you're working on, which is interesting for the businesses out there that are listening to us today, because you're working on the economic value of protected bicycle lands for the adjacent businesses that are around those lands. Tell us about that.
Okay, so we did a kind of the world's first study on how people got to restaurants and how money got to restaurants. And we went into cafes and restaurants and we asked them all, how did people get to your business? What percentage of your customers come by walking or by cycling or by using public transport or by driving? And which type of person spends the most amount of money? And all the businesses, almost every business owner or manager, and we spoke to the managers and the business owners, and they would say to us, car drivers are the majority of the people who come here, and they spend the most. They spend more than someone who comes by train or by bus. They spend more than cyclists. They spend more than walkers. Then we went and surveyed 300 customers, 100 each at different times of day and night in these different precincts. And we asked them, how did you get to these businesses? That included people who were going to the really fancy sort of restaurants with their stars and all the rest of it, down to more, middle class and type restaurants. And what we found was that the business owners just didn't understand their market. Car was responsible for way less income than what they thought. And really, public transport users spent the most because they bought alcohol. I mean, it's not rocket science. You can drink, you don't have to, avoid drinking. And there's a big profit margin on that for the restaurants. So that they didn't understand that really bemused us.